Are you guys wondering how the new Marantz SR8015 11-channel DTS-X Pro Atmos Auro 3D receiver did on the bench test? Stay tuned. Hey folks, I'm Gene Della Sala with Audioholics, and as promised, I'm going to go over all of my bench test results with you on the new Marantz SR8015. So as you guys know, I reviewed the SR8012 about 2 years ago, and I found in almost every category performance that receiver was really top notch. For a $3,000 11-channel receiver, there was only a couple of things I wanted to see improved upon, and we're going to go over that in this analysis here. But the great thing about this SR8015 is they built on a very solid foundation. And I'm going to show you how the evolution of this product has gone forward based on what I've seen on the bench with this SR8015. So to start off with, I wanted to show you a recap from last time. The only, I would call issue, it was a bench test issue more than a real world issue, was on the SR8012 is if you were using the preamp outputs on it and you were going above about a 1.4 volt RMS drive. So most power amplifiers need about 2 volts RMS to reach full power. Some of them are a little lower. It depends on the gain structure, but usually a gain of like 29 dB, you need about 2 volts RMS to get full power. So what I was finding, and this is not only a problem with the Marantz receiver, this is a problem with pretty much every receiver I've ever bench tested, but I never really understood why the FFT distortion got really bad above a little over a volt, even though the preamp wasn't clipping. Well, then I've come to find accidentally, because the amplifier section is always connected to the preamp. Even if you're not using them and you don't have a load, you don't have a speaker attached to it, or you don't have an 8 ohm load attached to the amplifier, that amplifier is still producing voltage. So if you crank the receiver volume control all the way up and it gets to the preamp is driving beyond 1.5 volts or 1.4 volts in this case, that power amp is already clipping. What that means is that power amp hit the rails, it's causing clipping, and that distortion is riding through the power supply going back into the preamp. And that's what we saw here on this SR8012. If you look at this FFT, the third harmonic was about 80 dB below the fundamental 1 kilohertz tone. This is not horrible. This is likely inaudible, but it's definitely not state of the art. And when I saw this, I went to Marantz. I said, hey, you know, is there any way you guys could better isolate or do something or change the gain structure or something? Well, that's when they came up with the Preamp Mode, where you could physically disconnect the preamp from the power amp if you're using it as a preamp, so that way you avoid this problem. So I want to go over those test results because I measured it both ways, and I want to show you how it's changed from the 8012 over to the 8015. Now I'm going to reiterate, if anybody already owns an SR8012, don't go and sell it and go and upgrade to an 8015, because it's still a good receiver. I'm not in any way trying to disparage any SR8012 owners. So with that said, I wanted to show you some quick features on what you get with the 8015 over the 8012. As I said in the unboxing video, you now have 13 channels of processing as opposed to 11. You have a preamp disconnect mode, which we just spoke about. Now, Marantz is claiming they have improvements to their HDAM circuit in their preamp section, and we're actually going to go over that because I measured that. The dual speaker preset allows you to store 2 different independent settings for your speakers, which is great if you want to do any type of dual calibration, depending on if your room acoustics change from, you know, if you have a screen that comes down and you close your blinds or whatever, the acoustics of your room would change. It's nice to have a separate calibration for that. The DTS-X Pro, that's a pending firmware update. It looks like it's going to happen sometime between mid to end of October, so we'll revisit that. And now you have front wide channel support, and you have the ability to actually do 13.1 channel Auro 3D with external amplification. That's pretty cool. So there's definitely some feature upgrades on the 8015, but let's look at the performance upgrades. So the power supply is pretty much the same. You still have that nice about an 835 VA transformer, 2 times 22,000 microfarad 81 volt caps. Big power supply. This receiver is rated at 140 watts times 11. Marantz guarantees you get 70% of that power for up to 5 channels driven, and we'll go over that. Very solid foundation for an AVR. And let's see. So I started out measuring the preamp mode using my 2-volt RMS output FFT. And as you can see here, the FFT is significantly better. We actually see an improvement of 20 dB compared to the 8012. And this is because we're basically not having that distortion problem anymore with the preamp disconnect. Now here's the interesting thing. I measured it with preamp disconnect, and then I measured it without preamp disconnect. And I want to show you the differences. So in this first case, actually, this was preamp not disconnect, and it was still 20 dB better. So this is just running it in a normal way. The preamp is still connected to the power amp. It's still allowed to clip the power amp, but you can see there's a 20 dB difference. This is way lower than it was up here. This was at minus 75 dB, and then this is at like minus 95 dB down here. That's a huge difference. I'm very impressed with the fact that Marantz was able to isolate their preamp section even when the amplifier section is connected. And that has something to do with their HDAM circuit. They showed me a schematic for it, but I can't share it here. But that's pretty significant when you think about how this was a problem with a lot of receivers that would plague them. And now it's not so much of a problem even when you don't use the preamp disconnect. So comparing between preamp disconnect at 2 volts RMS to regular mode, the preamp disconnect is a little bit better. The distortion's a little bit lower, but this is likely inaudible. And this is good news. This is great news for you. Actually don't have to necessarily use the preamp disconnect. You could still regularly connect and use the internal amps and still get excellent performance. Kudos to Marantz. This is a carryover now to all of their new AVRs with the preamp disconnect mode for Marantz for 2020. Because they have that new HDAM circuit. So now I also measured at 2 volts RMS the distortion across frequency range, not just at 1 kilohertz, but full bandwidth. And you can see right here, this is very low distortion at 0.001%. All the way out to 20K, you're still at 0.003%, which is about 90 dB, almost 90 dB down. When you look at this, this is an excellent performance. This is like dedicated pre-pro performance in a receiver. So now we look at frequency response. It's pretty much the same as the 8012. I think maybe the channel-to-channel variation is a little bit better. It's at plus or minus 0.06 dB from channel to channel, from 20 to 20 kilohertz. 3 dB point is at like 63 kilohertz. So that's way beyond audibility. You know, your ears fall off before 20K, you're covered. This is a great preamp section right here. It's very clean. The next thing we look at is signal-to-noise ratio using AES-17 filter. So that's A-weighted. This is a very good measurement. At 2 volts RMS, I got 110 dB. I think Marantz, they shared with me their test data, which I showed you in the unboxing video. And they measured, I think, 112 dB under the same test scenario. So we're within 2 dB of each other. I'm not going to cry over that. It's pretty similar. That's an excellent, excellent number. It's very clean, very low noise floor. Couldn't expect anything better than that out of a receiver, out of most pre-pros, for example. This is just a really good SNR. And I measured preamp mode with versus no preamp mode. I measured it with pure direct versus not pure direct. Didn't matter. The signal and noise ratio was the same. In fact, I really couldn't find any benefit to the pure direct mode. I know you guys like pure direct because it supposedly turns off circuits that you don't need when you're listening to audio. I couldn't measure anything beneficial from pure direct, which is kudos to Marantz for doing a clean, digital and analog isolation between the boards. So I want to go over the bass management. Bass management has always been top notch on Sound United or Denon and Marantz products. I've never had a problem with bass management. This follows the THX guidelines when you set 80 hertz crossover. So you have 24 dB per octave on the low pass, 12 dB per octave on the high pass. Didn't see any surprises here. This is exactly how the bass management. This is textbook good bass management. And of course you have the ability to vary the crossover settings, and you have the ability to do an independent 2-channel bass management setting as well. And then the LFE setting, I would recommend setting that to 120 hertz. That way you don't truncate the LFE channel that goes to the subwoofer. So another thing that I've started doing now, because a lot of Audioholics have been asking me, hey, can I see square wave of how, you know, the amplifier does with square waves? And, you know, I'm on the fence about even doing this. I guess it's kind of good to, as a housekeeping, to see how an amplifier responds to square wave. There's a bunch of overshoot in this square wave, and I checked with Marantz, and they said that's normal. That's actually characteristic of their slow roll-off DAC filter, and it's done deliberately to increase phase response or improve phase response out to 20 kilohertz. So I don't want to debate that too much because I don't really know if that really is something that's audible for most people, but it's just, I just threw that out here in case anybody wanted to see the square wave on the preamp. So let's go over the power section. I wasn't going to remeasure power since it's basically the same power section of the 8012, but the fact is when I measured the 8012, I accidentally had it plugged into a shared outlet instead of my dedicated 20 amp line. So I kind of shortchanged Marantz on power. So I figured I might as well just rerun all my power tests, which I've done here. So basically I do continuous full power bandwidth tests from 20 to 20 kilohertz for 8 ohm and 4 ohm loads for 2 channels driven. Then I do the instantaneous power sweep at 1 kilohertz at 8 ohms and 8 ohms for 2 channels driven, 1 channel driven, and 7 channels driven. It's kind of what you used to see back in the day with when the magazines used to actually do measurements of amplifiers. That's the power test they've done. 1 kilohertz testing is useful to show you the max capability of the power supply, but I still like to do full bandwidth testing just to see if there's any weird anomalies, which is what I did with the 2 channels driven 8 ohms and 4 ohms. Then I did the dynamic power test using a CEA 2006 burst test method. It's to simulate the dynamic headroom or the dynamic program material of music. It's just good to have all these different data points when you measure power. Of course, this is all across 8 ohm and 4 ohm load resistors just to be consistent. So we got, with 2 channels driven, actually did better on the 8015 than the 8012, and I think it's probably because of the dedicated line. But I got almost 160 watts, 159 watts at less than 1% distortion with both channels driven from 20 to 20 kilohertz. That's impressive. For a 140 watt rated receiver, we got 160 watts out of it for 2 channels driven. It's great. When we did 7 channels driven in the 1 kilohertz sweep test, we got 101 watts at 1% and 92 watts at 0.1%. Now the Marantz guarantee says 70% of rated 2 channels driven. That should be 98 watts for up to 5 channels driven. Guys, I got 101 watts for 7 channels driven. So we exceeded the Marantz 70% guarantee. That's awesome. I mean, that's very rare these days that you find an AVR that'll produce that much clean power with 7 channels driven. Now, this weird stuff here, where the distortion was going higher on some of the channels than others, which was still very low at 0.05. I come to find that it's because I had it on auto eco mode instead of off. And I think that's just some anomaly between it switching from low rails to high rails. Not something that will impact you in real life. By the time I realized I had it on auto mode instead of eco or auto off, I already did all my testing and I already broke down the resistors. So I wouldn't worry too much about this. When I measured the 8012, I didn't see that at all. Now, here's the interesting thing. When I did test the power, different eco settings, this is what I want to show you guys. The only time I tell you to use eco on is if you're using it as a preamp only and you're not using the internal amps. Eco on with just 1 channel driven knocks it neuters the power section of this receiver down to about 30 watts. So that's 1 channel driven. You see this in this green trace. Never use eco on. I know there's going to be someone that comments down below, I put eco on and it sounds better. Just like the people that like to use the impedance switch on the low setting when you should never use it on the low setting. Listen to me now and believe me later. Never use eco on if you're going to use the power amp section of the 8015, the 8012, or any receiver that has these eco functions. Eco auto is fine. As you can see, remember I was telling you about how that distortion was rising right before clipping? I think this is where that switching thing was occurring from low to high rail. Not a big deal. I would use eco auto This is with eco completely off. The power is the same. You're still getting the same power. It's just the switch out here is a little different. But eco auto really cuts down on heat dissipation on the chassis, because if you have an 8012 or an 8015 in a rack, and it does, first of all, make sure you have good ventilation, because there's 11 channels idling there. 11 channels. This is like a 7-channel sized receiver. This is what they used to use, the chassis, for 7 channels. Now you got 11 channels crammed into the same size chassis using the same size heat sinks. So you have to dissipate that power. And the Eco Auto, by setting it to the lower rail voltage, just lets those amplifiers idle at a lower power when they're not using that much power. It just lets the amp run cooler. So I would use Eco Auto in probably 95% of cases, and you won't find yourself starved of power. As you can see here, it's still hitting the power numbers. I had Eco Auto on up here, and I was still hitting 100 watts with 7 channels driven. It's a good mode to use. So the last test we did was the dynamic test. This was the CEA 2006, and we got 330 watts a channel with 2 channels driven. That's a good amount of dynamic headroom right there. That's excellent. And then I just did a power table here. And you could see, and this will be published in the written review, which will go on Audioholics soon. You can see the continuous full power bandwidth measurements for 4 ohm and 8 ohm loads. They're all done at 1%. Then all the different variations of sweep tests. And this is all here for you guys to kind of take a look at, people that like to look at power numbers. I try to run every combination of power I could and put it and tabulate it here so you guys could see it. And then I just did, you know, in my opinion, the most important is the first watt, and to see how clean the first watt is. And I ran an FFT at 1 watt, and I was very happy to see the harmonics down to about 95 dB from the fundamental. It's a very clean measurement. There's no real nasty power supply stuff going on here. There's no weird DC offset thing going on here. I mean, it's just a good design for amplifier, especially for a receiver. This is a 1 watt rating. It's very clean. It's a good sounding receiver, as I've found in the past. Then we ran crosstalk measurements. Now the way I do crosstalk is I run all the channels as disturbers except for the channel under test. That's a much harder test to pass than to just have one channel be the disturber and then check the channels in idle. This is called a 1-channel undriven test. And we still got minus 60 dB at 20 kilohertz for each of the channels that it went through. So this went through all the different channels that I tested, 7 channels, and look at that. Just like the SR8012, it just shows you a good layout. I like to see, you know, at least 60 dB of isolation out to maybe 10 kilohertz. This did 60 dB isolation out to 20 kilohertz. Very good job. I have no complaints about any of the measurements. In fact, I would have to tell you that this is probably the best measuring receiver that I've done, God, since like the super receivers, since like the Denon 5805 or the Yamaha RXZ11. I'm talking like this is almost at that caliber, maybe a little less powerful, but this is a very well measured receiver. There's really very little to complain about from everything that I've tested on this receiver. It's benchmark kind of performance. Stable. I didn't have any problems with this driving 4 ohm speakers. I've been running it in my system now for a couple of weeks, and just like the 8012, never had any problems running speakers on that as well that were 4 ohms. So I'm happy with the results, and I hope you guys enjoyed this test result that I have here. So why don't you do me a favor and comment down below. What do you think about the test results of this SR8015? I think it's pretty incredible you're getting all this kind of performance and all this feature set for, you know, around $3,000. I think the retail's a little higher, maybe $3,200 on this one. Still very impressive to me. Make sure you subscribe to this channel. If you like this video, please thumb it up. Don't forget about our Patreon at patreon.com/audioholics. And until next time, my friends, keep listening.